Okay.
In any time.
It shows live on my screen.
Okay. Very good evening, everybody. Bonsoir tout le monde. We are very happy to have Pranav Sharma as the first speaker of the Science Talks at the Alliance online. Pranav Sharma is a science communicator. He is the curator of the exhibition on CNES and ISRO Exploring Space Together. And today he is going to share his research on how India and France came together in order to build the aerospace capacity of India. Pranav, the mic is yours, and we'll have in the second part of that talk, Ram Babu asking him questions. So good evening, bonjour Pranav.
Bonjour Samuel, thank you so much. Bonjour friends.
Welcome.
Thank you. So it was very interesting that in March 2020, I curated an exhibition on Indo-French relations and space technology. And Samuel was very enthusiastic about the idea. So he connected me with Vice Matthew of CNES, and my research during this exhibition brought Jacques Blamont's contribution to light. So this guy, Blamont, has always been in some shadow. He was a bit shy to claim his work, but the enormity of his support to ISRO and Indian science is unequivocal. He was also honored with Padma Shri by the Government of India in 2015 for his contributions to the Indian space program. Several years later, from the beginning of the space program, Blamont wrote, and I quote, he says, "I had become a close friend of Vikram, and now I regret that I could not give him much of my time. I do not remember at which time around 1967 he took me one evening to a village about 50 kilometers from New Delhi. On a central esplanade, a television receiver placed on a scaffold was being watched by about 200 peasants trying to understand the images that were being relayed to them. Fortunately, the loudspeaker was good. An educative program was being broadcast by national television in New Delhi. Coming back in Vikram's car, we were not certain that the system had shown any efficiency, but it had obviously had a great potential. Later, Indian space programs like SITE and INSAT and EduSat had proven. But today, of course, direct TV by satellite has become universal and carry educational programs, which, though not to our expectations, have some value. When Vikram succeeded in creating ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, I was able to help him in various ways till the time of his unfortunate death. There was something unique between us since November 1963. When I was invited to the celebration of the 40th anniversary of ISRO in Trivandrum, I was reminded of an audience's reaction to the first ballooned flight in Paris on 4th November 1783. Somebody has asked what could be the use of that, and Benjamin Franklin replied, "What is the use of a newborn child?" A child was born on 21st November 1963, and we watched his achievements with admiration. Jacques Blamont, whom I just mentioned and quoted, he was the first scientific and technical director of the French Space Agency. When I assumed as the curator of the Space Museum here in Hyderabad, I was quite perplexed on how to possibly do justice to ISRO's legacy and yet keep things as easy as possible. The only thing that I could think of was to teach space sciences by tracking its origins and build it on Plato's notion, what Plato used to call curiosity is the mother of invention. So here I was collecting stories as a historian of science. And of course, in finding and unfolding things, I was desperately looking for a moment which could be termed as a moment of birth. French Space Agency, CNES, was established in March 1962, and Jacques Blamont had just become its technical and scientific director. He met Vikram Sarabhai. Vikram Sarabhai was then a Cambridge-educated cosmic ray physicist in Washington during the COSPA meeting. It was a General Assembly. Let me show you a very interesting picture of Sarabhai and Blamont here. So this was taken during the first launch in 1963. Going back after 1962's assembly, Jacques Blamont and Sarabhai had become very close friends. The guy on the left with the spectacles is Blamont, and on the guy on the right is Vikram Sarabhai. Jawaharlal Nehru, as we know, is the first Prime Minister of India. He saw science as a liberating force. And he inspired scientists and thinkers to work toward making India a scientific nation. He brought forward Science Policy Resolution in 1958, which started the ball rolling. Since he was quite accessible and was open to discussions, Homi Jahangir Bhabha was also called the father of the Indian nuclear energy program. He was also Nehru's very close friend. And both Bhabha and Nehru spent a lot of time brewing ideas. Sarabhai was primarily convinced that space technology is most essential for the all-around economic development of India. Sarabhai had everything in order back home in India when he went to COSPA in 1962. In Washington, he explained to Blamont his ideas with intoxicating enthusiasm. And I've had very interesting talks with people who knew Sarabhai as a person. And Professor Yashpal used to say that whatever you do, you just cannot say no to Sarabhai. He was that convincing. Sarabhai used to use the term leapfrogging. And he basically meant that the only way for India to catch up with the developed world was to bypass the usual stages of the process by exploiting ultra-modern technology. Blamont, of course, was not convinced with leapfrogging in space technology at that time, and it was very hard to imagine that scenario. Sarabhai wanted to use satellites to educate people in India. Illiteracy was a major obstacle in the development of the country. Several years later, Blamont reminisced in his book, and he wrote, "Imagine," he said, "a central station transmitting to a satellite education program prepared by excellent professors somewhere in a specialized organization, and the satellite relaying these programs to tens of thousands of villages where television receivers would display them to the local farmers." And as you remember, I just quoted Blamont earlier in this talk where they actually went and did that. Although indulging in space technology at that time was not a very objective idea, and it was a luxury to do so. I'll show you something very interesting here. This is C.R. Satya and Vallappan Nair. They're taking the rocket cone for the first launch. So as I speak, you can certainly relate to these two guys who were part of that very exciting program that was going on in the 1960s. So Blamont, of course, decided to help Sarabhai realize his dream as best as he could. Kinese has its limitations, as it was also in its nascent phase, but Blamont was convinced and he trusted Sarabhai with his instincts. So Sarabhai, Vikram Sarabhai, established INCOSPA, which was the Indian National Commission for Space Research, in 1962. And Thumba, which is a small town near Trivandrum in Kerala, was identified as the launching site. India adopted the French model and started learning the quote-unquote trade by launching sounding rockets. Although many people in the INCOSPA wanted to launch an electronic payload, getting one manufactured in India was a challenge. And Sarabhai asked Blamont for an advice, and Blamont says that to begin, that ISRO should begin with studying high altitude atmosphere with the creation of sodium clouds by rockets. This experiment should require no onboard equipment. As you saw in the previous picture that I showed you, this is Blamont and Sarabhai during the first launch that we'll be talking about now. So at the Thumba Equatorial Rocket Launching Site, we call it TRELS, Indian space program was launched by the taking off of an American sounding rocket called the Nike Apache on 21st November 1963. Jacques Blamont, the founding scientific and technical director of CNES, the French space agency, personally brought the rocket-based payload from France, called the sodium ejector payload, which was manufactured in CNES laboratory. This was the moment of birth that I was looking for. This was the birth of the Indian space program. Following this, 3 more rocket-based experiments were done. They were conducted by the French Centaurus, which was a 2-stage socket propellant rocket provided to ISRO by CNES itself. Now we move to a very interesting part of the talk, which is the birth of the Vikas engine. And you'll be delighted to see I was able to get the picture of the testing which was done in Toulouse. So ISRO entered into an agreement with this French space agency, CNES, under which ISRO was supposed to provide about 10,000 space-qualified pressure transducers to CNES. And in return, France would transfer know-how for their liquid engine, Viking, to ISRO. The indigenous version of Viking was then called Vikas. The 2nd and the 4th stages of PSLV, the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle, are now powered by liquid propulsion. As I've already mentioned that the basic know-how for the 2nd stage engine Vikas was obtained from France. Yet to translate engine design into fabrication drawings to identify the materials and processes associated with the realization of component parts like gas generator, turbo pumps, and whatnot. I mean, including hydraulic and pneumatic systems, and they really pose some interesting challenges. So to counter that, industries were roped in, and some critical technologies were made in in-house workshops. And the engine was realized towards the end of 1989. As our own test facility at Mahendragiri was not ready, the engine was taken to France and tested at the SAP. SAP is Société Européenne des Proportional Facilities. It was really heartening that at the very first attempt, the engine performed satisfactorily. At that time, the basic test facility for the large thrust rocket engines was being established at Mahendragiri, which is very close to Kanyakumari in Tamil Nadu. The stage test was also established later at Mahendragiri. This involved large structures which could withstand the thrust of the engine as well as the weight of the propellant tank. The facility was completed by establishing a network of instruments and control systems. Now, how was this possible? This was possible because there was a very interesting thing that I talked about, was the ISRO SEP agreement. So now I'll talk about the ISRO and the SEP agreement. The really major breakthrough in liquid propulsion came in 1974 when ISRO signed an agreement with the SAP of France. At that time, the French were developing the Viking liquid engine for the Air launch vehicle program. Without any transfer of funds, the agreement provided the technology transfer from SAP to ISRO for pressure transducers and Viking liquid engine. In return, ISRO would produce and supply about 10,000 pressure transducers to SAP and also spare the services of 100 man-years of ISRO engineers and scientists to SAP for their air and launch vehicle development. Now, here's an interesting thing about this entire agreement. Usually what you see is when you have an agreement, the know-how is transferred and then you're abandoned. But something really different happened here. To acquire the Viking engine technology, Indian engineers worked in all areas of development activities of the Air program. They participated in design reviews and progress reviews, and they even had interactions with European industries. They received all detailed design drawings and documents. They participated in inspection, in quality assurance of the systems and subsystems and their components. They also participated in assembly and integration, checkout and testing operations in the SAP facilities. They had discussions with SAP specialists and received clarifications to understand the technology fully. The technology acquisition program was successfully carried out under the leadership of S. Nambi Narayan, and about 40 engineers covering all areas participated in this technology acquisition program. On behalf of ISRO, the agreement was signed by T.N. Seshan, and he was then the additional secretary of Department of Space. So earlier, ISRO and Department of Space used to be two different bodies, which was later merged into one when Satish Dhawan was trained as the director. And this guy Seshan, if you remember, he became a very high-profile Chief Election Commissioner of India. And he was the one who coined the term Vikas to replace Viking in India. So Vikas in Sanskrit means development and also means flowering. And Vikas was also the acronym for Vikram Ambalal Sarabhai, the father of the Indian space program. In any case, that was how Vikas project was born for advantage of both France and India. Now I move on to the thing which is more popular than the space program itself. It is Apple satellite on a bullock cart. And I think that got a really good mileage in science communication. So Apple satellite, yeah, this is a very famous picture, very famous picture. So before I go to the French involvement in this, the thing that these people are doing there is basically trying to test transducers. So they were not able to find anything, and because if they were, I mean, if you get anything which has a motor and the parts were so delicate that any magnetic movement in any in the vicinity of the parts could cause serious trouble to the satellite. So the only non-magnetic environment they were able to find was a bullock cart. So this is very interesting. That shows how indigenous approaches work in different circumstances. So Apple was designed and built as a sandwich passenger carrying a meteosat on top and a capsule air technology CAT module and on the lower side. In case the flight model of Apple was not ready in time, they were to launch the flight-worthy structural model stored at Toulouse after composite stack test, of course, which would be returned to India only after the launch. It would have been an embarrassment if ISRO had not delivered the flight model on an agreed date. However, on the other hand, ISRO also had a setup. Had also set up an independent safety office of ISRO here back home. They did a couple of load analysis for the first time and transporting solid apogee motors on an aircraft and a storage in France and moving it to Kohu later, transporting Indian-made hydrazine to Kohu by ship. There were things which was accomplished against great odds. So Air India had been India's carrier, but at the critical moment, they faced a very they faced a critical moment in which they were supposed to get a chartered aircraft to come to Toulouse to carry the spacecraft to Kohu, and which could have violated the Loan Convention of 1975, which was a trade agreement. So Kohu, being on the French overseas territory, the mission engaged Air France. It's such an interesting thing how so many organizations were working towards a common goal. I mean, both back in India and in France. It is such a beautiful ecosystem which was working together for a greater goal. So I thought, I mean, these stories need to be told, and most of us don't even know how we began. In my journey as a curator, I discovered that the idea of the country, the India as we call right now, was very ambiguous at the beginning. It was very tough to break the cocoon of its subaltern identity. This majorly happened because science was shouldering the development of the country, as much as the governments was trying to connect to the nation. And needless to say that we had a lot of international support, and especially from France in the early years of ISRO. On 14th April 2020, around 11 a.m., I got a text from Vice Matthew that Blamont has passed away just a day before on April 30. I took a moment of silence and I thought that India had just lost a true friend that day. He was the last symphony from the founding era of Indian science, which ascended to the starry night. When Sarabhai was found dead, he had a book on his chest and he looked as if he was sleeping very peacefully. I thought of Blamont sleeping to dissolve and be one with the universe, to which he dedicated all his life. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pranav, for this fascinating journey into the history of Indian space program and the French contribution. We are extremely glad and proud that you gave the first science talk at the Alliance online. I also seize the opportunity to convey my regards to all the students of Alliance Française in Hyderabad, but also in India, because your talk is being streamed online on the Facebook pages of the Alliance Française in India. So a warm welcome to all the students and the friends of Alliance Française in India, as well as Institut Français and Campus France. It was very dear to our heart to start science talks at the Alliance because the history of Indo-French scientific cooperation is really anchored. It's very, very important for both countries, and it is still quite not really well known to the audience, to the large public. So thank you very much, Pranav. We also have Rambabu with us, who is going to ask you a few questions. Rambabu, are you here?
Yeah. Bonjour, Samuel. How are you?
Bonjour, Rambabu.
Fine.
Yes, bonjour, Pranav.
Rambabu is a science journalist and communicator. Rambabu, maybe you would like to ask 2 or 3 questions to Pranav.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Pranav, for giving a very beautiful insight into the journey of ISRO and seeing us together since 1960s. You have touched upon so many things which the current generation may not have access to. Thank you so much for that. I have few questions for you. One being across the world, many nations ventured into space, having the defense upmanship or conquering the defense sector in mind. In your opinion, what was the inspiration for ISRO to venture into space?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, there is this one time, say, Ishpan told me a very interesting story. He says, Sarabhai was so convinced that space is the way to go forward right now. So he went to Nehru and told him that we need a space program. Although Nehru was quite convinced because Bhabha already gave him a little background. So Nehru asked Sarabhai, why do you need a space program? And Sarabhai says that our country is very young. We just got independence. To which Nehru counteracted. He says, yes, we just got independence. We may not have fun. He said, it's all right. But because we just got independence, sir, we don't know how big our country is. If we send a satellite up in space, and if we look down on the geography of our country, we will know how big our country is. And that is the only way to connect with the country. I think Indian space program started much as a sociological program. We wanted to connect to our country. We wanted to talk to them. Even the communications program, we wanted to reach out to them. look at the, I mean, I would call them evangelists when it happened during the SITE program. I mean, the televisions were made in Ahmedabad. There were satellites being, used here and there. There were programs being made, scientists running to the villages. It's astonishing. It's astonishing.
And I have another question for you. Thank you so much for that insight. And I have another question for you.
Yeah.
Can you comment on the status of the interdisciplinary functioning between various departments? Because ISRO was altogether a brand new thing for India to happen. How ISRO became an entity by itself because of the interdisciplinary activity that was going on. How various other departments helped ISRO shape to the current entity as it is now.
It's very interesting. There was this one time, I think I quote Professor Yashpal more than I should. But in a memoir, he wrote, he says that at the Space Applications Center in Ahmedabad, there were about a couple of thousand of engineers and several hundred of sociologists working together without killing each other. So that was a great thing to achieve. And there was somebody who asked them, how do you manage to do that? I said, the only vision that we have right now is to build our own country. And there's another instance which is very interesting. MS Swaminathan was quite perplexed because he was not able to find out the origin of this disease, which was back then in Kerala in coconut. Everybody knows that. And because coconut is a prime food necessity in down south in Kerala, it was getting very difficult for people to do the usual everyday thing. So he approached Sarabhai and says, Sarabhai, we need a spatial image of that place. I'm not able to identify how far this disease is, and it's become very difficult to go in any direction possible. And Sarabhai very calmly said, see, Swaminathan, we don't have a remote sensing program right now. But what I can do is I can get you an image and let's get it done with. So long story short, they were able to get the image and the entire thing was mitigated. Now look at this very interesting thing. MS Swaminathan is an agricultural scientist. Vikram Sarabhai is a cosmic ray physicist. Both of them are doing space technology, which is in its nascent phase. I have no other word than astonishing. And that was the moment of birth of two interesting programs. One was the Green Revolution in India, MS Swaminathan was responsible for that. And at that moment of time, we realized that we need a remote sensing program. So that very moment was the moment of birth of the Indian remote sensing program. And there were so many other facilities which were working together, from Prime Minister's office to teachers and everything in between. And that is how we were able to run this Indian space program. And this Indian space program, I think, is the most prestigious thing that we've built since independence.
Interesting history behind the interdisciplinary functioning of various departments and how ISRO influenced so many other departments and enhanced their knowledge.
I mean, Seshan was additional secretary of space, who eventually became election commissioner.
I am really surprised to know that Seshan has coined this name for the Vikas engine. Vikas engine, that's great on his part. Question. Going forward, how from as of now ISRO is at X place. Going forward, how you think ISRO will leapfrog? I am using your own words part of the discussion. Leapfrog from here, whether it has the potential to leapfrog or it go into the metaphors into the journey as it is from 1960s onwards to 2020.
One thing which is very certain about Indian Space Research Organization is ISRO is a very international organization. We don't work alone. We've never worked alone. We started as a collaborative project. Thumba was a United Nations site. I mean, US was involved, France was involved, Soviet Union was involved. There were so many places. I mean, there's so many countries were involved in that place. And 21st century is the century of globalization. And rather, I've used the economic word, which is called the global localization. Now we are very close to each other. Look at, we are practically in 3 different geographical locations right now. And we are talking to people who are in several 100 kilometers from us. This is global localization. And because we are globally localized, our technologies are globally localized. So whatever will be happening from now on, especially in the post-pandemic world, it will be a joint effort internationally. And I think ISRO has a potential of leading on, because we have very interesting and very well equipped technology right now. We have the right amount of funding that is necessary. We have necessary people in place, and infrastructure and manpower is fine. But what I'm really looking forward to is that India will India lead the way for an international cooperative space program or not? I think both of you have to unmute your microphones.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insight into this, Pranav. We hope that ISRO will definitely going places internationally, as I said.
It will.
Yeah.
Like probably sometime from now, we'll be talking about that in another science.
Yeah, and this is really a very inspiring talk by you. And I hope many of the students of Alliance Française or many more watching in France and India will get an inspiration because of your talks.
Thank you.
Yes,
thank you, Rambabu.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pranav, too. Thank you to all the students and all the friends of Alliance Française in India. That was a Science Talk at the Alliance, organized from Hyderabad and by Alliance Française Hyderabad in cooperation with Institut Français. We are looking forward meeting all the viewers of these stream next week for a talk by Professor Srini Kaveri, research in immunology on COVID-19, basic and therapeutic aspects. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And don't forget the exhibition Exploring Space Together, created by Pranav Sharma on ISRO and CNES cooperation, will be traveling in India after the lockdown is over. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Bonne fin de soirée. Et à très bientôt pour de nouvelles activités. Don't forget, tomorrow there will be a live stream from Alliance Française Pune at 5 o'clock, and at 7 o'clock there will be a streaming of a cultural program from Alliance Française du Bengal. Bonsoir. Thank you again, Rambabu. Thank you again, Pranav.
Thank you.